Welcome to This Week in Coworking, where industry leaders get succinct, actionable insights. Here are your hosts, Hector Kolonas and Mike LaRosa.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the This Week in Coworking podcast stream. This is your weekly recap for week 13. I am Hector Kolonas. Today I'm joined by my co-host Mike LaRosa and a guest co-host, Eyal Lasker. Before we jump in, Mike, what's on our roster for today?
Hey, Hector, we've got a lot of news this week. So first top of mind is the news coming out of GSA. There's been a pilot program that selected 2 booking platforms. So we'll dive into that and figure out what's going on. We're going to have a really great chat with y'all here about the e-commerce Undercurrents report that you released earlier this week. So I can't wait to chat a bit more about that. And we've also got some interesting data coming out of Spain. There's a new kind of capital of co-working in that country. We've also seen an operator down under on a major tear announcing 6 new locations opening up in the next few months. And then last but not least, we've got a really creative post about where the best free co-working might be. And it's, I think, a little closer to your house than you realize.
Amazing. So before we jump in, this week's sponsor is FlexSpace AI. Joining us is their co-founder and CEO, Eyal Lasker. Eyal, how are you today?
Hey, Hector. Hi, Mike. Great being here.
Great to have you. So you actually introduced something really cool in the newsletter this week, something you call the pricing agent. I'm not even going to try and touch this. You tell us what it is in the simplest terms.
Yeah, definitely. Think about it as the pricing engine that hotels and airlines are using. We are bringing that to the co-working industry. There's no reason why pricing should be static, and definitely it takes a long time to update them manually. What we created is a system that can automatically update price to the optimal point based on supply demand, historical data, market movements, and predictive analytics.
That is awesome. Now, I know that all of us have discussed dynamic pricing at least 100 times in the last probably 4 hours, but how does this build on top of what FlexSpace has already done with dynamic pricing? You're one of the front runners in introducing this. What does Pricing Agent do further than that?
Yeah, we are a strong believer that you can actually optimize your bottom line by optimizing your pricing, right? One relates to the other. There are different ways to grow your profit line, better efficiency, cutting costs, but really optimize pricing through software is probably the most efficient way to drive all these extra dollars of revenue all the way to the bottom line. What we've been doing in the last year or so was V1 of dynamic pricing. Think about it as iPhone 1, right? We built the basic infrastructure and functionalities for operators to be able to have more flexibility in their pricing strategy. That was mainly rule-based and had involved a lot of manual work on our team. What we are able to do and what we worked on and invest a lot of resources over the past year was really taking that into the next phase, into the next era, and utilizing the best new technologies, which is obviously AI. So we took all the learnings and all the data that we gather from the past year or so and build a machine, an automated machine that leverages AI to really automatically analyze very large sets of data, which it's almost impossible for one kind of data analyst to do that manually. So very large sets of data to really understand what is the optimal price for a specific location down to a specific room or office. So our pricing engine today and what the agent can do is really figure out the best price for a specific hour of day or day of the week and for a specific type of inventory, right? So it can be, we're starting from meeting rooms, but what that will grow to offices as well.
My geek brain is spinning off in a million directions. Obviously, folks who are following the newsletter know I'm busy doing a deep dive into AI agents and how it affects all the parts of our businesses. That's one thing that I'd love to dig into a little bit more. But one of the first things that comes to my mind is working with so many operators on their tech stacks. They always ask about how much control do they have about the output? When it's rule-based, I know exactly what's going into the decision-making, right? It's procedural. I know that if the rule changes, it changes the outcome. With AI, it's happening in the cloud, in this black box. Is the agent updating prices automatically without any human in the loop? Or is there a way for it to suggest pricing and then operators to slowly implement that over time? What is your approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And those exactly the conversations that we had with our customers, with our partners. And it's definitely kind of a new way of doing things. And we understand that can come with some concerns. The way we build that is the operators, right? They have full control over the floor and ceiling price of the price range that the AI agent can compute and eventually introduce. So that gives a lot of control in terms of I don't want the price to be less than 20% of my base price or more than 25% of my usual price. So the three elements that are in control in terms of our pricing agent is what's my base price, what's my floor price, and what's my ceiling price. And within that range, the AI agent will go and figure out the best optimal price. What we've learned from doing dynamic pricing for so long now is really that the price is like that the market is very price sensitive. And that's something that coming into that, we honestly didn't know because that was really net new. But as we start introducing different price rules and pricing packages, we saw that actually 50% of the bookings going through FlexSpace have some dynamic pricing rule applied to them. That's a huge number, right? 50%. What we've also seen specifically for meeting rooms, that those pricing rules were able to drive 25% increase in number of meeting room booked. Huge, right? 25% more. We also learned what are the optimal discounts that can drive more conversion. And that was not a straightforward exercise to figure out because obviously there's pricing sensitivity, and it's not just about getting more utilization and more bookings. It's actually also figuring out how to generate more revenue and obviously profit.
All three important elements to making a successful co-working space. The margins are razor thin, and the more you can fill, the more occupancy you have, the better overall sustainability of the business. Now, obviously, FlexSpace is an e-commerce layer, right? Yes, you have this dynamic engine in the background, but you also have this layer that allows people to sell directly through their website. I'm going to use that as a segue to talk a little bit about the Undercurrents report that we dropped this week. Eyal, you were one of the two vendors who were interviewed as part of that series. In case you missed it, it dropped across 4 different mediums. It's the first time that we dropped a report in interactive web, downloadable PDF, video and audio all at the same time. And the response has been fantastic. But Eyal, having listened to it after you took part, any thoughts on what folks shared about e-commerce and co-working?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the two most important things, right? We cannot think about pricing optimization or pricing agent separate from the actual user experience and the UI that you build and present on your site. Because it's one thing to figure out what is the optimal price, but then the other thing is how you best serve this story of why this is the right price to your users. So the back end and front end are really tied together, right? It's not just like showing, okay, these meeting rooms today, the optimal price is like $300. That's really not the case. You need to build a full narrative around why $300 is the best value that you can get specifically for this meeting room at this specific day and hours. And that really ties back to the UI, your e-commerce platform, how you build the narrative, what are the components that you show your users and your customers to really tell the story of your pricing strategy.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm curious if you can shed a little bit more light on what type of data streams you're relying on for some of these pricing points, right? Is it just what other people are selling it for? Is it what the system thinks it could be sold for? Or are you taking into consideration sometimes we think of or we hear situations for Dreamforce in San Francisco or South by Southwest in Austin where there's like non-industry specific events, but large citywides that would then bolster those prices very similar to like hotels. I know for a fact hotels typically increase those prices somewhat manually for what the base is for that period of time or that week, and then let the pricing increase from there. I'm just curious, like, what all are you using to inform this?
No, you touch on all the right points there. So one, we are looking at historical data for that specific location, right? That specific location and every specific resource or asset in the location. So that's one, the location. The base layer is really the location itself. The second layer is the market around the location, right? And what's going on in that specific market. The next layer will be events, special events, exactly as you touched upon. So what we saw is that when you have the conference force, as you mentioned, and it's pretty consistent across the year in terms of where it's being held and when, then we will start seeing those trends in our historical data. But sometimes you have new events, new conferences or specific market events that are coming up. So our system also are looking ahead, right? What are the events in specific markets that can drive spikes in demand? And then on top of all this data set, that's where we layer in our predictive analytics model. And that's where really AI kicks in to take all the past data, all the market data, everything we know about the future, and compute and predict what will be the demand levels that the market will see.
So just to dive a little bit more, because I am a tech geek, much like Hector, but I'm also like a recovering event planner geek. Is this something that you're relying on local work operators to have insight on which citywides are being booked? And then is that shared data that then you can pull in for other operators? Like you mentioned that operators have the ability to log in and set certain parameters, or is that something that now is something that your team's going to keep an eye out for? Because you're right, a lot of these conferences do happen the same period of time, but sometimes weeks might fluctuate by one or two, depending on how holidays fall or whatnot. So I'm just curious to see like what your thoughts are on how best to manage that. And it sounds to me like you're almost going to be having another kind of data set of large events all over. You're going to be able to do more with that data if it's more complete.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where we really use technology, right? So no one needs to do manual entries. Our system will go out there to the web and really figure out all the events for specific markets, segment by what we defined as events that can impact and shift demand into co-working spaces. Obviously, conferences are a major one that we are looking into and synchronizing different calendars for conferences and events. So yeah, and it's not something that we ask our customers and partners to do manually. However, right, if they know that there is something going on in their market, they can definitely feed that into the system.
This is all fascinating stuff. And I'm actually putting something out to the listeners and viewers. If you'd liked us to do an Undercurrents deep dive into dynamic pricing and all the facets that go into kind of implementing it, the challenges, what's working, what's not, drop us a comment or drop us an email or just reply to the newsletter and let us know. I'd love to see if there's enough appetite for us to put something like this together.
Yeah, and in today's world where we have LLMs and AI in that form and shape too, the interesting thing about that for partners, for operators, for our product is that as we build that, it's almost like becomes a conversation, right? So a lot of the things you can just set and forget, right? We know operators are busy. We don't want to layer more work on their end. However, those that do want to engage and interact with the pricing agent will be able to do that shortly.
In the Undercurrents report, I actually talked about this thing called the billboard effect, where across the travel industry, folks find hotels, restaurants, or flights on online travel agencies or booking platforms, but like 50-ish% land up trying to book direct. Having said that, we did see some interesting move out of the aggregation space this week, we saw one of the largest employers in the United States, the US federal government, through their GSA department, put out and close a tender or request for proposals in under a month. So that's a record in its own. I've never heard of anything like that being done so quickly, but they actually put out a request for proposal for some technical system to help them analyze and run their spaces, their owned or rented spaces, but also to connect their federal workers with third-party spaces. I dove into a little bit about this with Mark Gilbert from Liquid Space. I know that Upflex was the other awardee. Just to update, I know it's a breaking story. There's 2 pilots running, one in Chicago, one in San Francisco. Both have been approved for up to 12 months. And the goal of both those pilots is to prove that this system helps make workspaces more efficient in the federal government. So that's the background. My question for all of you is, or to both of you is, how do you think this will impact co-working spaces directly? Will we see any kind of billboard effect? Will we see people who are introduced to co-working spaces through maybe a federal program, recommending it to their spouses, recommending it to their colleagues, recommending it to their partners they work with outside of the government? How do you think this is going to affect co-working in a bigger picture?
I think that this is overall really exciting to see that there's a kind of a big leap forward in the GSA strategy and direction. GSA embracing the concept of flexible workspace is nothing new. And for years, they've been very forward thinking as to, okay, how do we incorporate different elements of flexible and shared workspace? Some of them have been through internal pilots where they were trying to design their own equivalent of that internal flex workspace and understanding if different agencies can use the same type of space equally. The other big initiative was a contract vehicle that was awarded, I believe, 4 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago, time flies, but it was to a mix of platforms such as DeskPass and Liquid Space, as well as operators, WeWork, Expansive, and The Yard. And so what that was doing was the government was setting aside some stipulations as to, hey, if we do need to rely on flex workspace to supplement what we have in a current market, this is the process. The challenge is that with dealing with the government, all the price points were very much constrained. So there's already small enough margin in this product, and the margin was being shrunk. My takeaway from this new award that was just issued in this pilot, it's more so focused on existing space. How does the federal government more efficiently and effectively use the space that they have? In this report, up to 6 million square feet, right? Across, I think, a total of around 89 different buildings. That might have just been the Chicago number. I don't know if that was Chicago, San Francisco combined. What we've heard in the media from the DOGE efforts has been more focused on efficiency and effectiveness of using the space. But we've also heard in the news reports a lot of disconnect between agencies and reality. And so coming from DC, I've got a lot of folks that are in this industry that either work for contractors or for the federal government directly. Some offices are vacant, but then other offices, the people are sitting on the floor because there's not enough desks and there's not even enough bandwidth for the internet. So they're not even able to use video on Zooms. So my takeaway is that the government's really trying to solve for what space do we have that we either own or are on the hook for? How do we more efficiently use it and enable people to book it, tracking how it is used? And then lower on that priority list was the third-party space booking. And I think that's the biggest hurdle. I wish these firms nothing but the best of luck because this is an exciting opportunity. But having gone through this process with DeskPass, having won some of these awards, the stipulations can be quite lengthy as to what type of space is applicable, what type of space will work, what type of requirements there are, even down to identifying the manufacturer serial number of certain chairs to ensure that those chairs meet federal requirements, similar to how in France they have laws as to what type of chair you have to sit in if you're there for more than some number of hours. So like Hector said, this is a developing story. This is super exciting for the industry. Unfortunately, I don't see it moving the needle for third-party co-working spaces initially, I think it's going to be a little bit longer until we can see how that all falls out.
Yeah, that's great insights there, Mike. My take here, and I completely align with you. I don't know if we'll see the impact here specifically on our co-working industry, but what my takeaway is that truly work is changing and truly like the way we work is changing, right? And we're moving away from the monolith approach of this is your office, this is where you go 5 times a week to a network, right? So the government is trying to build their own network. I know, and I'm speaking with different landlords that are trying to build their network. So we're really moving and shifting, and it's 2025. So it's really the right time to move from like the DVD approach to the Netflix, where people can just open whatever app it is and really choose where they want to go, which type of office they want to work from. And to your point, how we can really persuade or shift people from highly packed spaces to the ones that have maybe less density. When you talked about that, it kind of reminded me of the approach, so corporate travel, for example, right, will give you incentives to book the cheaper flight, right, and get some reward or some points, right? In a way, it sounds similar, where you can actually incentivize employees to go maybe to the next location, not like the first one on their priority list, and really gain, I don't know, maybe it's like Amazon points or anything else to start shifting supply and demand.
I absolutely love that analogy of DVDs to Netflix. It's just a really cool way of looking at this shift. And you're absolutely right. There is the shift. And, I think it's 2 million employees learning how to use flexible space, whether it is third party or internal, is never a bad thing, right? These are skills or learned behaviors, learned patterns that will proliferate outside of that. At least that's my hope. And as Mike said, we do wish the platforms well. We'll keep reporting on it. It is a breaking story. We will dig a bit more. As we said, it's moving at record pace. They have to deliver something in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to keep an eye on that and report back. Now, this is obviously a global podcast feed, and so we're going to dive over to Europe and Australia and New Zealand very quickly. Mike, we saw 2 fantastic sets of stories from both Spain and Australia. Can you run us through that?
Yep. So much like what we're seeing in the UK and what we've talked about in the past, Valencia is now the hot new hub of co-working in Spain. So for years and years, everyone would focus on Barcelona. Barcelona was most definitely a pioneer in the shared space concept in the mid to late aughts. This news coming out is that they saw 12% growth in that specific market for new spaces opening up. And I think it just parallels what I said earlier to some of the data that we're seeing in the UK with tertiary markets starting to absorb more of this demand. And so I think demand and inventory is matching up in the larger metro cities. Spain's not a huge country, right? So we're not talking about major distances between these markets, but it is exciting to just see like another trend that's shifting in that general direction.
It also pulls up another trend, Mike, and that is the technical drop in average pricing for co-working in some countries. We saw this in the UK earlier this year, where the media was reporting that the average price per co-working space was coming down in the UK, forgetting the fact that there is now more co-working spaces in secondary and tertiary cities with an average lower price. And so, of course, as the number grows, the average comes down. That does not mean that the prices in London are coming down. So just keep that in mind, watching data coming out of Spain over the next couple of months and years. That is also going to play into the data, right? It's going to have a lower average, more volume, more demand, more profits. So absolutely keep an eye on that. And I think there were 2 co-working brands mentioned in that story. We've now started tracking them as well. So we'll start reporting more stories on them in the newsletter and on their own brand profiles. So shifting back over to Australia, our friends over at Watso, led by the awesome Jesse Glue, who I had the pleasure of speaking to a couple of months ago, they announced, I think it was 6 new locations, right, Mike?
Yeah, 6 new locations that are going to be opening up in the next 3 months, which is just a staggering amount of growth. I can't think of any other operator anywhere in the world that's opening at that speed with that many locations. I can't think of anything that comparable since pre-COVID back in the WeWork glory days. Not comparing Watso to WeWork, but just the fact that they're opening up that quickly is really impressive.
It's a really interesting story because Watso has been on a bit of a tear lately, right? Not only are they essentially a REIT propco opco, they're a publicly listed company who owns the property, but then has a sub company called Watso's Flex Space that runs the property. And they've set up this really interesting piece or model. They also reported a couple of weeks ago increased revenue across the network, led by their Flex engine, right? Led by the flexible department is driving bigger and bigger revenue. So it should be no surprise that they're expanding their Flex portfolio rapidly. But keep in mind, they're not doing rent arbitrage, right? They're not going out and strictly doing leases and cutting that up, going back to the WeWork growth strategy. This is mostly partnerships. It's mostly owned. It's their own kind of network that they're building. So fantastic growth. We're going to keep reporting on that and following them through that. One of the locations is actually also in New Zealand. So we're seeing an international expansion of Watso as well as they expand into the region. And we're going to try to get Jesse back on the podcast soon to just tell us more about what's happening in the Australian ecosystem.
Yeah, I think what's most exciting about tracking Watso is that a lot of operators that have scaled successfully have stuck with a single strategy. They either all leased or they're all entering into management agreements. But Watso's been really crafty and shown that you can do it in a variety of different ways, shapes, and flavors. So this expansion is coming through from a mix of, I believe it was some lease. There were some that they owned, and then they were entering into a management agreement in one scenario, taking over a former WeWork. So it's been really exciting to see how they've been able to navigate blending different financial models into one overall successful business.
They also did one interesting thing that I want to see more co-working spaces do. So every time I speak about Watso, I say this. They made a great partnership with Bubba Desk, bringing in maternity and parent facilities into their co-working spaces. I love this. It's a step in the right direction. I would love to see this expand across other global brands. So just throwing that out there as well. Just, more sustainable childcare is very critical to a big part of the audience who would like to use co-working spaces that are near schools, etc. So just love to see that as well. So the last story we're going to dive into today is the fact that we all forget that there's a sleeping competitor in almost every suburban and urban environment. And that is the beautiful, often neglected, often empty libraries. They are great spaces to get work done. You can put your headphones in. They're now adding collaborative spaces. We're seeing entire networks like out in Italy of librarians studying and implementing co-working practices and even playing with offering co-working passes as part of their memberships. So it's just a really interesting sleeping competitor that folks always knew was there. Whenever you speak to operators, you're like, who do you compete with? I compete with a coffee shop. I compete with the home office. I compete with other co-working spaces. But there is this often publicly funded space that is very often free to use that is just sitting there trying to figure out how to make themselves more useful to the same type of people that you're trying to sell co-working passes to. So with that preface, Eyal, Mike, what do you think about this sleeping giant?
I love it actually. And I love the idea. I love the fact that let's activate libraries. What's better than that? Let's drive people back to libraries, right? We are so into the social media and all of that, and people are reading less, and they're definitely like younger generation, not to exclude anyone, but I definitely think this is such a great idea. I love libraries in general. Definitely in New York, we have so many beautiful libraries, great spaces, public spaces, easy access. You don't need to go through the access controls and like elevators and all of that. You just walk in, and hopefully you also coming out with a book that you like, which is a win-win.
That's absolutely well said. And I love the libraries here in New York as well. But I do think they have one kind of image problem. And I've watched Monsters University a couple of weeks ago. That whole image of the librarian telling you to keep quiet, that is competing a little bit with the kind of collaborative side of co-working. But I completely agree that we should activate these spaces. I don't see them as competition. I think they're an introductory to working collaboratively, working remotely, and folks will want to upgrade to get a podcast studio, to get something else. So just a really interesting development. Mike, any last words before we hop out for the week?
No, I just thought it was a really smart post. Some of my favorite items that we share in this newsletter often come from folks that are not necessarily in our industry, right? This was a noted chief marketing officer, so he has no skin in the game, but it was really exciting to see him even come to this realization that, hey, libraries are great co-working spaces. I think that it's also something that could be put into practice to help fund these spaces moving forward. All we hear about are deficits and government budgets being cut. And so I think that this is a really great way to ensure that some of the resources can remain free and open to the public, but also those meeting rooms could be a nice revenue generator to help pad those budgets and the bottom line. All in all, a great thing to keep in mind. And it made me realize that having just moved, I need to go get a new library card myself. So that's on my to-do list for this weekend.
So hopefully the last thing on everyone's to-do list is hop over to thisweekincoworking.com, go and read this week's newsletter. Let us know what you think either in the comments here on YouTube and Spotify. But most importantly, take care of yourselves and we'll be back in your feed next week.